It's true.
Hey guys.
For a Zoom meeting of his own out there.
Aaron,
Yeah,
it's Leah. Can you hear me?
yes,
Hi. Is today your last session in the history?
no. Today is
Oh,
the
good.
eighth session. We have two more after this.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Jennifer, are we ready to start?
Yes, I think everybody's here. All the regulars.
Once again, thank you for joining us live, or if you're watching this on recording. This is number 8 in the 10-part series, Jews in the Soviet Union. We're talking about post-World War II today. And when we talk about post-World War II, talk about the Cold War. Now, the Cold War started basically right after, actually before the World War II was over. By May 1945, the Soviet Union had placed troops in Poland, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. And as Joseph Stalin said to a Yugoslav communist confidant, Milovan Djilas, whoever occupies a territory installs his own social system in it. Everyone introduces his own system as far as his armies can reach. That's the way it has to be. This was known as the Stalin Doctrine. And really, when you think about it, it's ultimately the imposition of a way of life, not merely a set of beliefs. And in order to impose a new way of life upon a people, one must abolish the previous way of life. So it's important to try to understand how radical this idea is. And in some ways, it represents the mirror image of a kind of radical annihilation that has been practiced throughout human history, where a conquering army comes in and annihilates the population that was there on the territory that they conquered. Stalin, of course, didn't do that. He annihilated a way of life. Now, there were several things that made it possible for the Cold War to develop. For one thing, the decline of the old great powers, France, England, and Germany, and the rise of a bipolar world, communism and capitalism, in the United States and the Soviet Union. In February 1946, George Kennan, an American diplomat, wrote a long telegram from Moscow. He was America's representative to the Soviet Union, in which he helped articulate the US government's increasingly hard line against the Soviets. Kennan emphasized that the Soviet Union did not see the possibility for long-term peaceful coexistence with the capitalist world. And the best strategy for the United States to pursue was to contain communism around the globe. And this became the basis for the US containment strategy towards the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, this gave rise to the beginning of state anti-Semitism. In 1948, Stalin ordered state security to destroy the Jewish intellectual and theater director Solomon Michaelis, and to disband the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Now, this is the beginning of the Stalinist campaign against the Jews in the Soviet Union in the Cold War. A little bit of background first. Back in 24 August 1941, during the war, 24 Jewish cultural figures, led by the Yiddish actor Solomon Michaelis, issued an international radio appeal to Jews around the world to unite in the struggle against Nazi Germany. Now, to allow Jews to appeal to their fellow Jews around the world was an extraordinary step for the Kremlin, But at the time, Stalin understood the need for the regime to repair relations with the Western powers in the face of German onslaught. Although Soviet officials were not happy with the committee's these were unauthorized initiatives, Stalin did not interfere as long as the war continued. But with the outbreak of the Cold War, the United States became the enemy of the Soviet Union, and all contact with the West was severely curtailed. The committee's wartime activities were now held against it. And the turning point really came with the founding of Israel in 1948. In September of 1948, Golda Meir visited Moscow as Israel's first diplomatic representative. She was greeted by huge cheering crowds at Moscow's main synagogue on the Sabbath and later on the high holidays. Such spontaneous demonstrations in support of a foreign leader, particularly the representative of a Jewish state, were regarded as a provocation by Stalin. And the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was held responsible. In November, the committee was officially closed and its archives confiscated. Over the winter of 1948-1949, hundreds of Yiddish cultural figures were arrested, including many people associated with the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. Now, Solomon Michels was already dead, having been assassinated on Stalin's orders the previous January. But a state anti-Semitic campaign was in full swing. It was a campaign against cosmopolitanism. Now, Stalin said, just as the entire German people must bear responsibility for Hitler's aggression, so too the Jewish people must bear responsibility for the actions of the bourgeois cosmopolitans. And I remember in the earlier class, we talked about how in 1943 and 44, Stalin exiled whole ethnic communities from their traditional homeland in the Soviet Union to Siberia and the Urals. And this is what it looked like for Soviet Jews. They became targets as tension grew with the West, and as Israel became allied with the United States. The Jews were viewed as a counter-revolutionary nationality. In 1952, Stalin announced at the 19th Party Congress, the Communist Party Congress, in a 25,000-word essay known as The Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, that the country faced capitalist encirclement. The ultimate purpose of this essay was to set the stage for a new purge. At this point, Molotov, Bakoyan, and Voroshilov were the last remaining old Bolsheviks in the upper reaches of the party. All the other old Bolsheviks had been killed in the purges of 1936 and 37. In November 1952, there was the Slansky trial in Prague. This is very important. Rudolf Slansky, who is Jewish, the former Secretary General of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. He, along with 13 others, were arrested and charged with engaged in a broad conspiracy with the United States and Israel to undermine socialist rule. 11 of the 14 accused were Jewish. And after a week of testimony, the co-defendants confessed to being Trotskyites, Titoist Zionists, and bourgeois nationalist traitors of the Czechoslovakian people. All 14 were found guilty, 11 were hung. In December 1952, a military court in Kiev sentenced to death 3 people with recognizably Jewish names for criminal conspiracy in the field of trade. The party journal, Agitator's Handbook, printed a prominent article against Zionism. But the height of Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign occurred in January of 1953 with the so-called doctor's plot. Stalin's personal physician, Vladimir Vinogradov, was arrested along with 8 other Jewish doctors working in the Kremlin's medical clinic. They were accused of being foreign agents engaged in a plot to murder leading Soviet military figures and Stalin himself. The doctors were taken to the Fortovo prison, where they were tortured and accused of espionage on behalf of the Americans and the British. And to give you some idea about how widespread the anti-Semitic doctor's plot was, I included 2 texts, one from an article in TASS, which is an official Soviet newspaper, January 13, 1953, and another from the same date from the front page of Pravda. From the TASS article, some time ago, the agencies of state security uncovered a terrorist plot of doctors who had made it their aim to cut short the lives of active public figures of the Soviet Union by means of sabotaged medical treatment. These doctors have now confessed to their crimes. These doctors had also been targeting military officers, among them 3 Soviet marshals, an army general, and an admiral. But arrest disrupted their evil plans, and the criminals did not succeed in attaining their aim. They were nothing less than monsters in human form. From Pravda. Whom do these monsters serve? Notice the wording. These are not just criminals or plotters. These are monsters. Whom do these monsters serve? Who directed the criminal, terrorist, and wrecking activity of these vile traitors to the motherland? What purpose did they want to achieve through the murders of active public figures of the Soviet state? The bosses of the USA and their British junior partners know that it is impossible to secure mastery over other nations by peaceful means. Feverishly preparing for a new world war, they are sending more and more of their spies into the USSR and the people's democracies, trying to succeed where the Hitlerites failed, trying to create a subversive 5th column in the USSR. Nearly every day for the next 6 weeks, the Soviet press questioned the loyalty of the country's Jewish citizens. Now, the outcomes included patients refusing to take their medicines or give medications to their children when their doctors were Jewish, out of fear of poisoning. Widespread calls for the Jews to be removed in managerial and leadership positions, and explicit anti-Semitism, extension of anti-Jewish purges to Hungary and Romania. Rumors began to spread that Stalin intended to deport Soviet Jews to far exile, for example, Kazakhstan, Siberia, Azerbaijan. And remember, in the 1930s and 40s, Stalin had deported numerous entire populations of what he considered to be ethnic troublemakers, including the Koreans, Chechens, Ingush, Meskhetian Turks, and Crimean Tatars. However, it is interesting that no historians ever found documents confirming that Stalin had drawn up plans to deport Soviet Jews. In contrast, several Soviet dissident figures expressed the belief that such a deportation plan for Jews existed. What about the Jewish reaction at this time in the Soviet Union? There were about 2.5 million Jews living in the USSR, overwhelmingly urban often highly educated, with visible roles in scientific and cultural institutions. The mood of terror and dread spread so rapidly that an act of repression seemed an inevitable conclusion to the case against doctors. So what happened and why wasn't there widespread repression against the Jews in the Soviet Union? Anybody know? Stalin died. Stalin died on March 6th, 1952, before a plan could be set in motion by him or anybody else to deport Jews to Azerbaijan or Siberia. So let's ask maybe, and have a little discussion at this point, about what were Stalin's motives? Was it simply that Stalin became more open about an anti-Semitism that he had always held?
Can I interrupt you for 1 second, please?
Sure.
You didn't mention what holiday Stalin died on. What
No, I
Jewish
didn't.
holiday?
You know what? I did not know that. Thank you for bringing it up.
He died on Purim.
Yes, thank you. You're right.
You didn't know that?
No, I had read that and I forgot to note that and follow that up in my notes.
Also, he died in 1953.
53. 53. 53.
53, yes.
Thank you for correcting me. So was it that Stalin became more open about an anti-Semitism that he had always held? Was it primarily a product of domestic and foreign policy calculations? Was it a plan to keep Russian society mobilized by provoking anxiety about external threats and using domestic groups as scapegoats? Was anti-Semitism a means of putting pressure on Stalin's Western opponents, the US in particular? All of the above. What do you guys think? Anyone with any opinions?
Well, you know, anti-Semitism was pretty common back then. I mean, even Roosevelt grew up in kind of an anti-Semitic, Franklin Roosevelt grew up in an anti-Semitic environment. And when he was younger, I think he was not very into diversity, let's say. So, you know, it could be that he had this deep-seated kind of anti-Semitism that he kind of muted when it was necessary. But then, you know, I think a lot of people who have a lot of power end up getting very paranoid.
Well, Stalin, near the end, especially in 1952, exhibited some classic signs of paranoia. It's also interesting that when he was a youngster, Stalin at first studied religion and was going to become a priest. That was his original intent. That was his original field of study. So we talked about in earlier classes how anti-Semitic the Russian Orthodox Church was. So he may have imbibed some of his anti-Semitism from back in his young days. But I think it was a result of all four. That it was a result of a domestic and foreign policy calculations. It was part of a plot to keep the society mobilized. You know, something to really understand too, at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union was decimated in the number of people who had died the amount of property destroyed, the ruin of the economic system. And it's very interesting. People had hoped, previous to World War II, that communism would bring a better way of life, not just ideologically, but materially to the Soviet Union. And of course, that didn't happen. And not only did it not happen, but it was widely recognized among Red Army troops. The further east they went across Europe until they hit Germany, the more they realized how much of a better material way of life the Europeans were living than they were. And there was a widespread disillusionment among soldiers and the average person in the Soviet Union. And in the 1930s, communism promised a better way of life. But there was nothing to look forward to after World War II. There was this no promise of a better way of life, only more and more hardship, more and more ideology. And in order to sustain that, you need to keep the people mobilized against an external enemy. And so a large part of that anti-Semitism, according to a number of historians who have studied the Soviet Union, is that it was part of this campaign to keep society mobilized by provoking anxiety about external threats and using domestic groups as scapegoats. In April 3rd, 1953, the Central Committee Presidium resolved to fully rehabilitate and release from custody the doctors and members of their families arrested in association with the so-called wrecker doctors. And one of the reforms that accompanied the announcement was the banning of the use of torture against those who were arrested. And not just the doctors, but all those who were arrested at the time. However, in the post-Stalin era, Jews were widely regarded as an untrustworthy nationality. What did that mean, in fact, to the Jews in the Soviet Union? Well, they were effectively barred from sensitive posts in the Foreign Service, in the military, in the KGB, and in the Communist Party leadership. An interesting statistic, in 1953, only 8 of 1,443 members of the Supreme Soviet were Jewish. Interestingly also, there was not a single reference to Jews or the Holocaust in the 6-volume official Soviet history of the Great Patriotic War, published as late as 1963. At the same time, Jews remained part of the Soviet professional elite. 95% of the Jews in the Soviet Union now lived in urban areas. Jews represented 11% of college graduates in the Soviet Union versus 2% of the Russian population. The number of scientific 10,000 people was 135 out of 10,000 compared to 10 out of 10,000 for the Russians. At the same time, Jews were becoming more and more assimilated. In the 1959 census, 410,000 Jews out of 2.2 million gave Yiddish as their mother tongue. Now, during this era, anti-Zionism became an official ideology in the Soviet Union, especially as the Soviet Union became a major arms supplier to Egypt beginning in 1955. Zionists were attacked for their alleged collaboration with the Nazis and for Israel's alleged support for West German revanchism. Remember, at this point, Germany was divided into East and West. East Germany was a satellite, of the Soviet Union. And West Germany was, for all intents and purposes, a satellite of the United States and Great Britain, because they were contributing to the rehabilitation of West Germany. In 1964, Joseph Brodsky was put on trial in the Soviet Union. Joseph Brodsky was a Russian Jewish poet. He was tried for crimes against the state. He was found guilty of being a social parasite and sentenced at the end of his trial to 5 years of exile and hard labor. And I included a transcript of the trial between the judge and Joseph Brodsky. From the trial, the judge: "You worked at a factory for 1 year and then didn't work for half a year. During the summer, you participated in a geological expedition and then you didn't work for 4 months." And the judge listed the places where Brodsky had worked and the intervals between his jobs. "Explain to the court why you didn't work during these interviews and why you led a parasitical way of life." Brodsky answers, "I did work during the intervals. I did just what I am doing now. I wrote poems." The judge: "That is, you wrote your so-called poems? What was the purpose of changing your place of work so often?" Brodsky: "I began working when I was 15. I found it all interesting. I changed work because I wanted to learn as much as possible about life and about people." The judge asks, "How were you useful to the motherland?" Great question. How useful were you to the motherland? Brodsky answers, "I wrote poems. That's my work. I'm convinced. I believe that what I've written will be of use to people, not only now, but in future generations." This is interesting to me because it gives you an idea about the mentality, the official Soviet mentality that was going on in the Soviet Union at this time. And in our next class, we're going to be talking about how that manifested itself and how that played out among Soviet Jews in the beginning of the Soviet Jewry movement to emigrate that started in the 1960s. Anybody have any questions about the Cold War and about the position of the Soviet Jews at this time in the 1950s after World War II?
It's very interesting that in spite of the fact that Jews were so despised in Russia and anti-Semitism was so rampant, they did not want the Jews to leave. As a matter of fact, anytime Jews applied for exit visas, the only thing that would happen to them, they were summarily fired from the jobs that they held. They had a very difficult time to continue working anywhere, but they were not permitted to leave.
Okay, that's exactly correct. And do you know why?
No.
Because there was 2 reasons and 2 issues involved. Number one, remember I said this is the height of the Cold War. This is not only a political war, but it's an ideological war. The Soviet Union was the leader of the communist world at the time. The enemies were the United States, Great Britain, West Germany. Now, where would any Jew, and of course Israel, where would any Jew who wanted to emigrate from the Soviet Union want to go? Either to Israel or to the capitalist, one of the capitalist nations. And what would that show people in the Soviet Union? That these places were attractive and these places where people where people wanted to live as an alternative to life in the Soviet Union. Now, in an ideologically led state like the Soviet Union, that cannot be seen as an attractive alternative. Okay, that's your enemy. Here are people who want to leave. They're saying that they want to leave the motherland to go to the land of their enemies. You can't have that. Okay? Why? Because for anybody who lived in the Soviet Union who had any doubts about the legitimacy of the Soviet Union as a system, that would only give food for ammunition, food for thought and ammunition for those who opposed in any shape or form, and not just Jews, but anyone who opposed communist life in the Soviet Union. So they took a hard stance against immigration for those reasons. And secondly, remember what I said, that Israel was considered to be, and Zionism was considered to be, the class enemy and a reactionary movement. And why would you encourage, if you are the leader of the communist world and a revolutionary movement and hope for the future, why would you want to give anyone the opportunity to move to a reactionary place in the world, particularly a Jewish nationalist state? Those were the two main reasons. Does that make sense? Any other questions?
Yeah. Hi, Aaron.
Hey, Paul.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, isn't this time frame, isn't it when Trotsky was still active in the party?
No, Trotsky was dead. Trotsky was assassinated in the late 30s, either 36 or 38. So Trotsky was long gone.
Okay, now, also at one time, under Lenin's administration, wasn't Trotsky on the same level as Stalin, and
Yes.
Stalin was able to overcome him?
Yeah, Stalin was able to overcome everybody. Yes. Yes, he was.
And so that's why he left to go to Mexico. And
Yes, but it wasn't. Now, one thing that I'll have to say, that Stalin did not, and Trotsky was not, she was Jewish by birth, but he was not Jewish in any other sense of what we would think about, someone who's concerned about the Jews as a people, as a nationality, as an ethnicity, or in any other way, shape, or form. Okay? I'm sorry I don't have any quotes to give you, but Trotsky did not consider himself to be Jewish in any shape, manner, or form. And Stalin was not anti-Trotsky because he was anti-Semitic. He was anti-Trotsky for other reasons. Number one, because he was consolidating power, and Trotsky was the most formidable opponent. Because remember, Trotsky had, as head of the Red Army, had prevented the Soviet Union from being defeated by the whites and the nationalists in the Civil War, as we discussed a couple of classes ago. And Trotsky was a revolutionary who believed that it was necessary to make revolution throughout Europe and every country in the world. And Stalin had come to the conclusion that that was not going to happen. And of course, it didn't happen that way. That the revolution involved making the Soviet Union a totally revolutionary and Bolshevized society first. And that had to be done. Does that answer your question, Paul?
yeah, sure does. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, then. In next week's class, we're going to start the movement for immigration the Soviet Jewry movement. We're going to talk about what happened in Russia in the 1960s and 70s. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Jennifer, once again for helping us technologically in the class.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Thank you all for joining us. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Be well and have a good week.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. See you next Sunday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Be well.